On the beaches of Normandy in the grey dawn of June 6, 1944, the greatest amphibious invasion in history was about to begin. Thousands of ships crowded the English Channel, carrying over 150,000 men toward the fortified coast of Nazi-occupied France. But awaiting them beneath the sand and shingle was an enemy as deadly as any machine gun nest or concrete bunker. Millions of buried mines, carefully planted by German engineers to turn the beaches into killing grounds. The Wehrmacht called their extensive minefields the Devil's Garden, and with good reason. A single mine could destroy a tank, kill a dozen men, or stop an entire advance in its tracks. As Allied planners prepared for D-Day, they faced a terrible question. How could their armies cross these deadly barriers without suffering catastrophic casualties? The answer would come in one of the most unusual and visually striking machines of the Second World War, a modified American tank fitted with a rotating drum and lengths of heavy chain that beat the ground like a mechanical flail. This was the Sherman Crab, and on the morning of the invasion, it would prove itself one of the most vital weapons in the Allied arsenal. This is the story of how British ingenuity transformed an ordinary tank into a mine-clearing marvel, and how the men who crewed these strange machines helped open the path to victory in Europe. The problem of landmines had plagued military forces throughout the war, but by 1943 and 44, it had reached unprecedented scale. The Germans, masters of defensive warfare, had turned mine-laying into an industrial process. Along the Atlantic Wall, the network of fortifications defending occupied Europe, German engineers had planted an estimated 6.5 million mines. These were not crude improvised devices but sophisticated weapons, anti-tank mines capable of destroying the heaviest armour, anti-personnel mines designed to maim and kill infantry, and booby traps rigged to explode when disturbed. The mines were buried in complex patterns, often combined with barbed wire, concrete obstacles and interlocking fields of fire. Intelligence reports reaching Allied headquarters painted a grim picture. Any attempt to storm the beaches of France would require crossing through dense minefields while under heavy fire, a prospect that promised enormous casualties. Traditional methods of dealing with mines were slow, dangerous, and inadequate for the scale of the problem facing the invasion planners. Combat engineers could clear mines manually, probing the ground with bayonets and carefully lifting each mine, but this painstaking process took hours to clear even small areas and exposed the engineers to enemy fire. Explosive charges could be used to detonate mines, but this required soldiers to approach the minefield, place the charges, and withdraw, again under fire and at great risk. Artillery bombardment could detonate some mines but was unreliable, and often simply buried mines deeper, or displaced them unpredictably. What was needed was a method that could clear lanes through minefields quickly, reliably, and without exposing soldiers to direct fire. The solution would need to be mobile, armoured, and capable of keeping pace with an advancing army. In short, the Allies needed a mine-clearing tank. The concept of using mechanical means to detonate mines was not entirely new. During the North African campaign, British forces had experimented with various devices, including rollers pushed in front of tanks and ploughs that dug up mines. One early design, developed by a South African engineer named Abraham Dutoit, used a rotating drum mounted in front of a tank with chains attached that beat the ground, detonating mines through percussion. This concept, called the barren mine flail after its inventor's nickname, showed promise, but the early versions were unreliable, underpowered, and mechanically troublesome. The first flail tanks, based on the Matilda chassis, saw limited action in North Africa with mixed results. The mechanisms frequently broke down, the chains wore out quickly, and the entire apparatus was difficult to maintain under combat conditions. Yet the basic principle was sound, and British engineers continued to refine the design, knowing that a working mine flail would be essential for the invasion of Europe. The breakthrough came with the development of what would become known as the Sherman Crab, officially designated the Mine Exploder, tank-mounted, Mark II. The design was created by a specialised unit called the 79th Armoured Division, commanded by Major General Percy Hobart, an innovative and sometimes controversial officer who'd spent years developing specialised armour for breaching fortifications. Hobart understood that the invasion of France would require not just conventional tanks, but a whole menagerie of specialised vehicles, each designed to overcome specific obstacles. His division would eventually produce an array of unusual machines, including swimming tanks, bridge-laying tanks, and flame-throwing tanks, but among the most important would be the mine-clearing crab. The name came from the sideways scuttling motion the tank made as it cleared mines, moving slowly and methodically across the minefield like its crustacean namesake. The Sherman Crab was based on the American M4 Sherman tank, the reliable and numerous medium tank that equipped much of the Allied armoured forces. The choice of the Sherman was practical. It was available in large numbers, mechanically dependable, and familiar to crews and maintenance personnel. But the modifications required to transform a Sherman into a Crab were extensive and ingenious. Mounted in front of the tank was a cylindrical rotor, approximately 9.5 feet wide, positioned just ahead of the tank's tracks. This rotor was powered by a separate engine, a Bedford engine producing over 100 horsepower, mounted on the right side of the tank's hull. The rotor spun at approximately 43 revolutions per minute, and attached to it were 43 chains, each about 5 feet long, fitted with weighted steel balls at their ends. As the rotor spun, these chains whipped forward and downward, striking the ground with tremendous force, detonating any mines buried up to 9 inches deep. The physics of the system was straightforward, but the engineering was complex. The chains had to be heavy enough to detonate mines reliably, but light enough that they wouldn't snap under their own momentum. They had to strike the ground at the correct angle, and with sufficient force, which required precise calibration of the rotor speed and the tank's forward velocity. The rotor mechanism had to be robust enough to withstand the constant shock of detonating mines, the impact of flying debris, and the stress of continuous operation. The separate power unit had to be reliable and easy to maintain, even under combat conditions. Control systems had to allow the tank commander to raise and lower the rotor assembly, engage and disengage the flail, and operate the tank's main armament, all while keeping the vehicle moving forward at a steady pace. The result was a mechanical marvel, a precisely engineered system that could transform deadly ground into safe passage. The visual appearance of the Sherman Crab was extraordinary and slightly disturbing. With its rotor assembly extended and the chains spinning, the tank looked like some monstrous hybrid creature, a mechanical beast thrashing the earth before it. The chains created a visible blur as they rotated, and when they struck buried mines, the explosions threw up columns of dirt, smoke, and debris. The noise was tremendous. The roar of 2 engines, the mechanical clatter of the rotor and chains, and the irregular percussion of detonating mines. Witnesses described the sight of crabs in operation as both fascinating and terrifying, like watching some industrial demon methodically beating the ground. German soldiers who encountered crabs for the first time reported confusion and fear. The machines seemed unlike anything else on the battlefield, and their purpose was not immediately obvious until mines began detonating in their path. Operating a Sherman Crab required skill, courage, and considerable nerve. The crew consisted of 5 men, a commander, a gunner, a loader, a driver, and a co-driver, who also operated the flail mechanism. The co-driver's position was particularly demanding. He had to control the auxiliary engine that powered the rotor, monitor its speed and performance, raise and lower the flail assembly, and watch for mechanical problems, all while the tank was moving and potentially under fire. The driver had to maintain a steady speed, typically about 1 to 2 miles per hour while flailing, following a carefully planned path to ensure complete coverage of the minefield. The commander had to navigate, communicate with other vehicles and infantry, watch for enemy threats, and coordinate the overall operation. All of this had to be done inside a steel box filled with noise, vibration, and the constant knowledge that they were deliberately detonating high explosives just feet in front of their vehicle. The dangers faced by crab crews were considerable and varied. The most obvious risk was that a mine might detonate too close to the tank or in an unexpected location, potentially damaging the vehicle or injuring the crew. Although the flail system was designed to detonate mines safely ahead of the tank's tracks, malfunctions could occur. Chains could break, sending weighted ends flying unpredictably. The rotor could jam or fail, leaving the tank stranded in the middle of a minefield. More seriously, crabs were priority targets for German anti-tank weapons. Enemy gunners quickly learned that destroying the lead mine-clearing tanks would halt an entire advance, so crabs often drew concentrated fire from anti-tank guns, Panzerfausts, and enemy armour. The Sherman's armour, adequate for a medium tank, offered limited protection against heavy German anti-tank weapons, and the prominent flail mechanism made crabs easy to identify and target. Training for crab crews was intensive and specialised. At training grounds in England, crews practiced the complex procedures required to operate their unusual vehicles. They learned to judge the correct speed and rotor rotation to ensure reliable mine detonation. They practiced maintaining straight paths across fields, an essential skill since any deviation could leave uncleared strips in the minefield. They rehearsed the coordination required between driver, co-driver and commander. They learned to recognise the signs of mechanical problems and to perform field repairs on the flail mechanism. Most importantly, they trained to overcome the psychological challenge of deliberately advancing into minefields, trusting their machine to protect them from the explosives buried ahead. This psychological preparation was as important as the technical training, for operating a crab required a particular kind of courage. Not the sudden bravery of a charge, but the sustained, deliberate courage of moving slowly forward into known danger. As D-Day approached, the Allied High Command faced critical decisions about how to employ the specialised armour of the 79th Armoured Division. British and Canadian forces fully integrated Hobart's vehicles, including the Sherman Crabs, into their invasion plans. Detailed schemes were developed for clearing lanes through the beach obstacles and minefields, with Crabs designated to lead specific assault teams. The Americans, however, were more sceptical of specialised armour and declined most of Hobart's vehicles, including the swimming DD tanks and the mine-clearing Crabs, with consequences that would become tragically apparent. On the British and Canadian beaches, Crabs would be among the first vehicles ashore tasked with the vital mission of clearing paths through the beach defences. On the American beaches, engineers would have to clear mines manually under fire, a far more costly approach. On the morning of June 6, 1944, as the first waves of Allied troops approached the Normandy coast, the Sherman Crabs prepared for their baptism of fire. On Sword Beach, Gold Beach, and Juno Beach, the British and Canadian landing sectors, Crabs were among the specialised armour loaded onto landing craft. The plan called for them to land in the early waves, immediately begin clearing lanes through the beach obstacles and mines, and open routes for following infantry and armour. Everything depended on these ungainly machines working under the worst possible conditions, while partially submerged in seawater, on unfamiliar terrain, under heavy enemy fire, with confused and chaotic fighting all around them. The crews knew that the success of the invasion and the lives of thousands of soldiers depended on their ability to make their strange machines perform as designed. The reality of D-Day was, as always, more complex than the plan. Some Crabs landed successfully and immediately began clearing operations, their chains thrashing the sand and detonating buried mines with precisely the violence they were designed to produce. On Gold Beach, Crabs of the Westminster Dragoons flailed paths from the water's edge up to the seawall, allowing following infantry and vehicles to advance with minimal casualties from mines. Witnesses described the surreal sight of these tanks methodically beating their way up the beach while machine gun fire sparkled off their armour and artillery shells threw up geysers of sand around them. The crews worked with mechanical precision, following their training despite the chaos of battle around them, clearing lane after lane through the deadly obstacles. But other Crabs faced immediate disaster. Some landing craft struck underwater obstacles or mines before reaching the beach, drowning tanks and crews in the cold waters of the channel. Some Crabs bogged down in soft sand or were disabled by enemy fire before they could begin clearing operations. On Sword Beach, several Crabs were hit by German anti-tank guns positioned in fortified positions overlooking the landing areas. Their prominent flail mechanisms made them easy to identify and prioritise as targets. Mechanical failures plagued some vehicles. The complex flail systems designed for reliability, but operating under the most severe conditions imaginable, sometimes failed at the worst possible moments. Chains broke, rotors jammed, auxiliary engines flooded with seawater and died, leaving tanks stranded and vulnerable. Yet despite these setbacks, the Crabs performed their vital function. On the British and Canadian beaches, where Crabs were employed, the advance inland proceeded more rapidly and with fewer casualties from mines than on the American beaches, where such vehicles were absent. Omaha Beach, the American landing that became synonymous with D-Day carnage, saw engineers attempting to clear mines manually while under devastating fire, suffering horrific casualties in the process. In contrast, on Gold Beach, cleared lanes marked by tapes allowed infantry and armour to move inland relatively quickly, avoiding the bottlenecks that proved so costly elsewhere. Military historians analysing the invasion have consistently noted that the specialised armour employed by British and Canadian forces, including the Sherman Crabs, contributed significantly to their ability to secure their objectives with lower casualties than suffered on the American beaches. As the battle moved inland beyond the beaches, the Crabs continued their dangerous work. The hedgerow country of Normandy, the bocage, presented new challenges. German forces had mined roads, field entrances, and likely avenues of approach. They had positioned anti-tank weapons in the thick hedgerows, creating deadly ambushes. The Crabs had to operate in terrain far different from the open beaches, clearing paths through narrow lanes while vulnerable to close-range attack. The crews developed new tactics, working closely with infantry, who would suppress enemy positions while the Crabs cleared mines. They learned to recognise the signs of German mining patterns and to adapt their techniques to different terrain. The slow, methodical work continued day after day, week after week, as the Allied armies pushed deeper into France. The experience of Crab crews during the Normandy campaign was one of constant tension and sporadic terror. Much of their time was spent in the tedious but essential work of clearing suspected minefields, many of which turned out to contain few or no mines. But this routine was punctuated by moments of extreme danger, sudden encounters with enemy armour, anti-tank ambushes, or the violent detonation of particularly large mines or booby traps. Crew casualties were significant. The prominent nature of the Crabs and their role at the front of advances made them priority targets. Tanks were lost to enemy fire, mechanical failure, and occasionally to mines that the flail system failed to detonate. Replacement crews arrived regularly, trained hastily, and took over the battered vehicles to continue the work. The psychological strain on Crab crews was considerable. They knew that they were always first into danger, that their survival depended on mechanical systems that could fail, and that they were high-value targets for enemy gunners. The constant noise and vibration of operating the flail system was physically exhausting, and the slow pace of mine clearing meant prolonged exposure to enemy fire. Yet they also took pride in their specialised role. They knew that their work saved lives, that every mine they detonated was one that would not kill or maim a fellow soldier. They developed a strong esprit de corps, a sense that they were part of an elite unit performing a vital and dangerous mission that few others could accomplish. As the Allies broke out from Normandy and began the rapid advance across France, the role of the Crabs evolved. In mobile warfare, with German forces retreating, there was less need for systematic mine clearance of every field and lane. But the Germans continued to plant mines as they withdrew, particularly on roads and bridges, attempting to slow the Allied pursuit. Crabs were used to clear these obstacles quickly, allowing the advance to continue. They also participated in assaults on fortified positions, clearing mines from approaches to bunkers and strongpoints. During the crossing of the Rhine and the final advance into Germany, Crabs again proved essential, clearing paths through German defensive positions that had been heavily mined in anticipation of the Allied assault. The technical evolution of the Sherman Crab continued throughout the war. Engineers made improvements based on combat experience, stronger chains that broke less frequently, better protection for the auxiliary engine and rotor mechanism, improved controls that allowed faster engagement and disengagement of the flail system. Later versions incorporated lessons learned from hundreds of hours of combat operations. Maintenance procedures were refined, spare parts supplies were improved, and training was updated to reflect actual combat conditions. By the end of the war, the Crab had evolved from an experimental device into a mature weapon system, reliable and effective when properly employed. The statistics of mine clearance operations are difficult to compile with precision, but the scale of the Crab's contribution is evident. During the Normandy campaign alone, British and Canadian forces cleared hundreds of miles of roads and countless fields, allowing the advance to proceed with relatively few casualties from mines. Individual Crabs cleared thousands of mines during their service lives. The Westminster Dragoons, one of the primary Crab units, cleared over 10,000 mines in the first weeks after D-Day. Other units posted similar numbers. When one considers that each mine represented a potential casualty or destroyed vehicle, the value of the Crabs becomes apparent. They did not win battles in the conventional sense, but they made victories possible by clearing the path for others. The human stories behind the statistics are equally compelling. There was Sergeant Harris, whose Crab took a direct hit from an 88mm gun while clearing a road in Normandy. The crew escaped, but Harris returned under fire to retrieve classified documents from the burning tank. There was Lieutenant Morrison, whose Crab cleared a path through a minefield under heavy mortar fire, allowing trapped infantry to withdraw to safety. There was Trooper Davies, the co-driver who managed to keep his flail mechanism operating despite mechanical damage, clearing a vital lane during the crossing of the Seine. These men and hundreds like them performed their dangerous work with professionalism and courage, rarely receiving public recognition, but earning the deep gratitude of the infantry and tankers who advanced along the paths they cleared. The appearance of the Sherman Crab, always striking, acquired an almost legendary quality among Allied troops. Soldiers waiting to advance through a suspected minefield would watch anxiously as the crabs moved forward, chains whirling, deliberately provoking explosions that threw dirt and debris high into the air. The sight became associated with safety, with the knowledge that trained crews were taking the risk so that others would not have to. Conversely, for German defenders, the appearance of crabs signalled that a major assault was imminent, and that one of their most effective defensive tools, the minefield, was being systematically neutralised. Some German soldiers reported that the psychological impact of watching their carefully laid minefields being cleared by these unstoppable machines was profoundly demoralising. By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the Sherman Crab had proven itself an essential tool of modern warfare. It had cleared paths through the Atlantic Wall, opened routes through the Bocage, swept roads across France and Belgium, and helped breach the final German defensive lines. It had saved countless lives and enabled advances that would have been impossible or prohibitively costly without it. The Crab had validated the vision of officers like Percy Hobart, who understood that specialised equipment, designed for specific tasks, could multiply the effectiveness of conventional forces. It had demonstrated that engineering ingenuity, properly applied, could overcome even the most formidable obstacles. The legacy of the Sherman Crab extended beyond the Second World War. The concept of the mine flail, proven in combat, became a permanent part of military engineering. Modern armies continue to use descendants of the Crab, updated with new technology but based on the same fundamental principle: a rotating drum with chains that beat the ground, detonating mines safely ahead of advancing forces. Contemporary mine-clearing vehicles are more sophisticated, with better armour, more powerful engines, and improved flail systems, but they are recognisably descendants of Hobart's ungainly Sherman conversions. The Crab established mine clearance as a specialised military function, requiring dedicated equipment and trained personnel, a recognition that persists in military doctrine today. The Sherman Crab also stands as a testament to a particular kind of innovation, the kind born from urgent necessity and refined through bitter experience. It was not elegant in design or appearance. It was a functional solution to a deadly problem, engineered with the materials and knowledge available and improved through hard-won lessons from combat. It required no revolutionary technology, no secret weapons or wonder materials. It succeeded through careful engineering, thorough training, and the courage of the men who operated it. In an age that often celebrates technological sophistication, the Crab reminds us that sometimes the most effective solutions are those that combine practical engineering with human determination. For the men who crewed the Sherman Crabs, the war was an experience of sustained tension, broken by moments of terror, of tedious routine punctuated by sudden violence. They performed work that was essential but rarely glamorous, clearing mines while others received the glory of advancing and capturing objectives. Many were wounded or killed, casualties of a role that placed them always at the front of danger. Yet they persevered, day after day, from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany, clearing the path for others to follow. Their contribution to victory was immeasurable, even if it was often uncounted in the headlines and histories. Today, surviving Sherman Crabs can be seen in military museums, their flail mechanisms now silent, their chains still and rust-spotted. Museum visitors marvel at these strange machines, at the ingenuity of their design and the courage required to operate them. The Crabs stand as monuments to a specific moment in military history when the problem of German minefields threatened to stall the liberation of Europe, and when British engineers and soldiers responded with a machine that, for all its ungainly appearance, proved exactly what was needed. They remind us that wars are won not only by weapons and tactics, but by the less celebrated work of engineers and specialists who solve the practical problems of combat. The Sherman Crab was not a war-winning weapon. in the sense of a devastating bomb or an unstoppable tank. It did not destroy armies or capture cities, but it performed a function that was absolutely essential to victory. It cleared the path forward, allowing others to advance where otherwise they could not have gone. In doing so, it saved thousands of lives and enabled operations that shaped the course of the war. It was a weapon of liberation in the most literal sense, liberating ground from the curse of buried explosives and opening the way for armies to advance toward victory. The strange tank with spinning chains and mechanical thunder achieved exactly what it was designed to do, and in the history of military innovation there can be no higher praise than that.